Hello and welcome to Global South Adda. At Global South Adda, we discuss issues that are pertinent to building scholarship in and about the Global South. In the last discussion, we chatted about some of the issues that students of IR confront when dealing with questions of decolonizing IR, and how some of the issues that are perhaps at the center of decolonizing IR debate can at times be very tangential to the concerns of producing scholarship in the Global South. Today, we explore this further and focus on how, why, or indeed whether there is this Western dominance in the discipline. Now, for this, we'll speak to two scholars whose cutting-edge work on the sociology of knowledge production in IR has helped us to understand the various ways in which scholarship from the South has contributed to the discipline. But going further, they've also explored the several constraints that apply to Global South scholarship. They have investigated institutional cultures, the quality and rigor of research, the audience that this research seeks to reach, and in general looked at the ways in which the discipline is dominated by the West, and indeed whether this Western dominance is by design or by default. Between the two of them, they hold expertise on India, Brazil, and South Africa, or what used to be called IBSA in the good old days. And one could also, I guess, add France, UK, and the Netherlands to the expertise now. And in our chat today, we'll go deeper into some of the findings of their research, but also try and benefit from their fertile minds on several other aspects of their own scholarship. So I'm very pleased to have today Dr. Karen Smith and Dr. Audrey Alejandro. Well, Karen is a very treasured colleague from Leiden University and someone whose work I've looked out to for the longest time. She also wears a policy hat of being the special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the responsibility to protect. But we have her today in a rather less fancied category of being an IR theorist of tremendous repute, and one whose work on South Africa and African IR has been truly inspiring. She's also recently edited an IR textbook for the Global South with another inspiring scholar, Arlene Tickner. And hopefully we'll also get to chat about the book. On the other hand, we have Audrey, who teaches at the London School of Economics and has done some fascinating work which can be placed at the interstices of IR, sociology, and political science. Her recent book, Western Dominance in International Relations, explores the sociology of IR in India and Brazil. And it is indeed a stunning ethnography of IR research in these two countries. Where actually she demolishes certain myths about Western dominance and provides a really rich context to the shape of the discipline in these two countries. Among other things, she's also the co-convener for Francophone Association for Caribbean Studies and co-editor for a Palgrave series on trends in European IR. I'm also very pleased to note that we are in the company of two very good teachers, and both of them have teaching awards to their credit. So welcome, Karen and Audrey.
Thanks, Vineet.
Thank you.
So before we start, I thought it would be wonderful if both of you could give us a peek into your own disciplinary biographies as to how you came into the discipline, your own journey within the discipline, who were the people who you were influenced by, who inspired you, whose works you yourself are very sort of, read, and how you have arrived at your sort of current research agendas. So perhaps Karen, you can start.
Yeah, well, thanks, Vineet. I mean, it's such a long time ago. It really means I have to kind of dig back into my memory. But I did all of my degrees, undergraduate, master's, and PhD at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, which I guess is quite unusual in a sense. I mean, at one stage I did dabble with the idea of doing a PhD in the UK. I'd even identified a supervisor, and I was set on going. And then I'd spent 2 years in the dreary UK weather, and spent a summer back in South Africa, and decided that perhaps I should do a so-called homegrown PhD. So I went back to Stellenbosch to do it. So the University of Stellenbosch really is kind of the place where I guess I developed as a young scholar. And Stellenbosch is an interesting place for people who don't know, perhaps South Africa that well. It's generally associated with being a kind of, Afrikaner bastion of apartheid. So it's not a place that has a very positive association for most South Africans. I guess people abroad think of it in terms of the wine, which is perhaps a more positive association. But I think Stellenbosch is an interesting place for me because people have this stereotypical view of it. But my experience was quite different, especially in terms of scholarship and IR. If you think back, yes, of course, there were many people, and there probably still are a lot of people in Stellenbosch at the university who are quite conservative, who were supporters of the whole apartheid project. But at the same time, that also meant that you had people who were resistant to this, so who were rebels. So at the same time, Stellenbosch was also the place where we saw the origins of Afrikaner resistance to the apartheid project from a kind of intellectual position. So people specifically from the politics department and from the philosophy department. And, so politics, this is the department where I got into contact with these people as a young undergraduate. I should also mention that, I was doing my, my undergraduate studies in the early 90s. So this was, of course, the heady days of political transformation in South Africa. And, these were the times of the negotiated, pact to bring about a democratic South Africa in 1994. So these were very, very exciting times. And I mean, for a young scholar studying politics, it was an incredible time, both in terms of studying politics and experiencing what was going on, in South Africa. And I think thinking back, this is probably where I first experienced the kind of mismatch between what we were learning in class and what was happening outside. I was thinking back, we had Haywood's textbook on politics, which was using all, British examples of, democracy, etc. And this didn't quite match what was happening, out in the streets in South Africa. So I think already there were kind of seeds planted in my mind where, I was thinking, why are we using these textbooks that don't seem to really relate to our own experience of what's happening out there? And that, became, I think, increasingly relevant to me as I started later. Then I started teaching in 2000. When I started teaching students myself, and I was feeling this frustration with trying to make what we were learning in class relevant to their experiences. And I should say here that, there were some very interesting people in Stellenbosch as well in the politics department that shaped me in this way. So for example, Philip Null, who's now at the University of Otago in New Zealand, he was my master's and my PhD supervisor. And he was someone I think who, was ahead of his times in many ways. So he was one of the leading, IR scholars in South Africa. And of course, the whole history about how IR, came about in South Africa, how it was a very insular field, obviously, because of partly the academic boycotts, etc. But, thinking back, he was the co-editor of a textbook in 1999. So, this is going back quite a while, a textbook an IR textbook for Africa. So this was in collaboration with the Institute for Global Dialogue, and it was co-edited with Pat McGowan, who was a visiting scholar and who really, I think, emphasized a kind of very critical IPE approach. So again, ironically, if you studied at Stellenbosch, which people have this idea of as being this very conservative place, and you did international relations, particularly IPE, you came out of there thinking that IPE is all about world systems theory, Coxian critical theory, because this was the kind of stuff that you were being taught. I'm speaking a lot, so maybe I should stop there, but I should perhaps mention one person, and I've been thinking about this. I think the person who's had the most influence on me from Stellenbosch is a very good friend of mine, and I only, thinking back about how my work developed, he's the person I think that planted most of the seeds, and that's Janus van der Westhuizen. We wrote the first paper together on, what is now my main research field, which is kind of IR from the Global South. We presented it at a BISA conference in 2005. So yeah, but I'm going to stop there. I'm looking forward to hearing what Audrey has to say.
Karan, I'm going to come back to Stellenbosch again. I'm going to come back
Okay.
to the cohort that you had with Giannis and Ian Taylor, you, I guess, Mizukisi. There are several people who come around at the same time, but I'll come back to that. Audrey.
Okay.
So I come from an uneducated background. So when I finished high school, I had never heard about social sciences. And I went to see the person in high school giving advice about career, etc. And I told him what I wanted, what I was interested in, so he could help me. And in fact, since I was a kid, I was obsessed with the way people use language to tell you what is possible and not possible to do, and how people use language to tell you what is not normal and not normal, and what they can decide what is not normal and okay, not normal. And from primary school, I started really facing resistances about that. So it was really a big theme in my life, me saying I wanted to do something and people telling me that if it was so easy to do something, everyone would be doing that. And so I was arrogant, thinking I could be doing that. So I arrived at the end of teenagehood, like with 10 years of fighting against those discourses. And I told that person I wanted to work on that. And he told me, then if you're interested in language, you need to go to humanities. So I did my first undergrad in combined humanities, and I'm a second generation immigrant. I took my major as Spanish translation. And in France, when you come from low socioeconomic background, at that time at least, you have a scholarship for poor people. So in fact, I could do 5 years of undergrad with that scholarship. And at the end of the first undergrad in humanities, I realized that the humanities were not politicized enough for me, so I needed to go somewhere else. And then I ended up doing a second undergrad in law and economics. And I did it in 2 years because I had only 2 years left for my scholarship. And then I realized that law and economics was also not politicized enough for me. So after that, I did the MSc in international, a master's in international relations. And there it was very life-changing for me because, so you ask your question more about like influences in terms of people, but for me, really what influenced me is concepts. I learned concepts that changed my life in my master's. So I learned about the concept of ethnocentrism. I learned about the concept of reflexivity. And really this was such a relief, so life-changing to know there were words actually to talk about what I was obsessed with, and that there were other people interested in that, and there were actually people earning money, working on that, thinking about that. I was like, it was amazing for me. So I decided I will do that. I got a scholarship for the PhD, and that even if I don't stay in academia, I was just obsessed by this type of issue. So if academia didn't want me, I will work somewhere else into fighting ethnocentrism and this kind of thing. And finally, academia wanted me. And in my first job at LSE as a fellow, when I went to the UK, after I got the job, the person who hired me gave me a call to talk about my workload. And she told me, oh, we have been waiting so long to find a discourse analyst. And in fact, until that point, even if I've always been talking about discourse, I never realized that actually discourse was a skill. I always thought of myself about working on knowledge. And then she gave me that identity. And since then, I also work on discourse. So this is what I think is my trajectory, those big concepts that either were given to me or that I discovered in my readings. And it seems that even like if I work the next 40 years on them, I won't have enough time to achieve everything I want to achieve using those concepts.
Can I ask you though, why did you choose India and Brazil as your case studies? And I'm asking, I mean, because your work is not simple like reading secondary literature on these places. Your work was actually going there, interviewing people, meeting people in the field. I guess one needs to know certain, not just about the culture, but also some bits of the language. So why did you choose these two countries?
So actually, I got the scholarship to do a comparative analysis between India and China. And I chose those cases because as BRICS, global emerging powers, etc., there were, in the research design, there were easy cases for the literature, because those BRICS countries are supposed to be, they're framed as being at the leading edge of the fight against Western dominance in IR. So therefore, if I could show that it's more complex and more nuanced than that, I will have a strong argument. And since I wanted to work on primary sources and do interviews and do participant observation, in China, I need partnership because my capacity to, I don't know how to speak or read Chinese, so I need the partnership to be able to conduct that investigation. And for the first year of my PhD, I tried to find such a partnership, and everything I could find was quite superficial. So I say, okay, you need to make a decision here, and I decided to give up on China, and because I already spoke Spanish, to learn Portuguese and just to do the work in Brazil. And why I didn't pick South Africa, which was also part of those countries, because when I started reading about the South African context, it was so complex in terms of post-apartheid situation, different linguistic structuration, etc., that I felt that it would be easier for people reading me to say, oh, but South Africa is too unique, and therefore, like, it's hard to learn from it. So that's why between India, Brazil, and South Africa, I ended up with India and Brazil. And actually, I'm very glad because they're so different. At the same time, from the outside, they could, like in the literature, they're often treated as the same. And actually, they have nothing to do in many regards. And so, very interesting.
It's interesting, like all three of us were at some point caught by the dream of IBSA. I mean, I started essentially for the same reasons. India, Brazil, India, South Africa, Brazil. I could not do Brazil because I didn't know the language. I was like, I'll focus on India and South Africa, which I'm glad I didn't go to Brazil. Otherwise, our interests would have clashed. But anyways, so let's get to, your work. And there are sort of several, commonalities in both your work. You both look at, this whole phenomenon of Western dominance and Eurocentrism in IR. You both talk about a certain current use of the term, the curse of policy relevance, which has hindered the development of a theory in the Global South, and so on and so forth.
Which actually, if I can add, is actually a term from Janus van der Westhuizen. So, yeah.
You should get Janus next time, actually.
Exactly.
But sort of the obvious question to ask would be that why is there Eurocentrism? Why is there Western dominance? And that's a question asked in every conference that you go to today. So I'll not ask that question. I'd rather ask a question, which actually Audrey asks in her thesis, which in some ways is counterintuitive, but also deceptively simple. And Audrey, correct me if I'm misrepresenting you. But Audrey asks, or rather says that, and it's also sort of implicit in Karen's your work, that the very question that why is there Western dominance is Eurocentric, because you're assuming that the social value of a certain kind of research in the West ought to be the social value of a certain kind of research in the non-West, right? So the division between theory and empirics, all IR journals, if you are doing theory, you climb the social hierarchy and so on and so forth. And by that standard, you evaluate everyone else, and everyone else is not doing theory, which then means that, and then there's this, so everyone else needs to be pulled up to do theory of a certain kind. Now, of course, we can talk about what is theory, a certain kind of theory, blah, blah, all of that, everything can be theory in some ways. But the assumption is that, one, that there are not enough non-Western people doing this kind of work, which shows that there is Western dominance. But the implicit assumption also is that there's a whole lot of incompetence there in the Global South, that they are not able to do it, they're methodologically weak, and so on and so forth. Some of them are justifiable reasons. But what Audrey asks is that, have you ever asked these people, if there is Western dominance, or if they're interested in doing the kind of work that you want them to do. And her answer overwhelmingly is no.
Okay, so
yeah, can I just say one thing though?
Yeah.
It's not overwhelmingly no, but so she has this wonderful chart at some in the book on, it's a TRIP survey of 2014, where I think the question asked was is the field very Western dominated or whatever. It's interesting, all the cases in the North, in the global North, they all say overwhelmingly, yes, it's Western dominated, something needs to be done about it. But in the global South, the answers are very different. Most Brazilians don't seem to think it's Western dominated. Taiwanese, a great number of Taiwanese scholars don't feel so. A great number of Indians feel that it's Western dominated, but Indians have a love-hate relationship with the West. They're very critical of Western dominance and Eurocentrism, but they also love the West in certain ways. They appreciate the plurality of discourses in the West and so on and so forth. A lot of times, the opposition to the West is also a form of positioning you're doing yourself, and a whole sorts of things are happening here. But the point being that in the non-West, the response, if you ask them, is there Western dominance? There's a wide variety of response you will get. It's not that it is Western dominated. So what then I wanted to ask all of you, sort of both of you, is in your own work, what would be your answers to why this is the case? That why one there's assumed to be a Western dominance, and why do people in the global South, assuming that they don't want to engage with the mainstream IR, why don't they want to engage with the mainstream IR?
Well, I'll let Audrey go because she was going to say something earlier.
Sorry, Audrey. Yeah.
So first, I think the part of the problematization of the construction we have to do is that there is one academia in the West and one academia outside the West, because academia in France and in the UK, they are regulated by very different logic and very different tradition. And the same way, academia in Brazil and in Thailand have nothing to do with each other. So this binary already to saying there is one group here and one group there, this empirically is wrong. Those categories for that specific sector, those categories are political. They are linked to our identities. And when we use them, they also have social effects that, to my point of view, are counterproductive for the diversification of the discipline. So, and I forgot what was the question already. What was the question?
The question is, why don't people want to engage with, the global?
Yeah. So then, in sociology of science, and in my work, you still see that academic fields are still mainly structured by the state, by career development, by type of funding, and then it's in each national field, you have different incentives for doing different type of works, and some of them are more oriented towards internationalization, and actually different networks of internationalization. Not all the countries are oriented to the US market. So that means if you're oriented towards another market, for example, area studies, you may have a different incentive of the type of things you are supposed to publish than US type of articles in US journal. And therefore, there are so many cases that you need to investigate. And in the case of India and Brazil, most of the scholars are interviewed, and the fieldwork was in 2012. So already a lot has changed since 2012. But Indian scholars, for diverse reasons, were not incentivized to publish in foreign Anglo-American journals, because this is not what was valued symbolically, for example, in comparison to influencing the public opinion in India. This was not valued in terms of career advancement, because those type of publication was considered very costly in terms of time and in terms of investment for the type of rewards you had on your career. But in Brazil, in comparison, publishing abroad was very valued, but publishing abroad was not necessarily publishing in an Anglo-American journal in IR. Because, for example, there are a lot of scholars working in the more historian type of tradition of IR. You have a lot of scholars also involved in different type of networks that were not necessarily English speaking, for example, in South America or in other languages in Europe. So there is a diversity of modalities of publication, which from a sociology of science point of view is not surprising. But for me, the conversation in IR is being trumped by those political categories, those identity we impose on the sector.
Farhan?
Yeah, there's so much. I mean, yeah, there's so much. Yeah, go ahead, Vineet.
No, I just want to sort of, while you answer, you know, in one of your pieces, you said, and you interviewed somebody, and this person said, you know, every thesis that has passed through me has Africa in the title. So there is that compulsive need to just write about Africa, which, like Audrey was saying, it's shaped by your local conditions. People don't want to write about IR theory because it doesn't help their careers. So yeah, so just what would you say about?
Yeah, so much, I mean, in your initial kind of question and then Audrey's response as well. And I just wanted to pick up on this idea of kind of binaries. And of course, you know, I mean, I've been guilty of that as well, making this distinction because it's an easy shorthand to make, you know, between the West and the non-West. And that's, you know, now it's more the kind of global South and the global North. And I've increasingly realized that, you know, this is a very dangerous thing to do. Because it leads us down a you know, potentially very dangerous path. And I thought a lot about this, you know, when I was still at the University of Cape Town in 2016 with all of the protests that started with Rhodes Must Fall, and then kind of, you know, became something very different and lots of many different things. Because, you know, when you start assuming that there is this kind of very clear distinction, then, you know, you create this us-them kind of dichotomy. And then it becomes very easy to kind of say, as, you know, many of the protesters in South Africa at the time did, is kind of, you know, we write off everything that is Western. But you're kind of buying into this category that, you know, as Audrey said, is actually a kind of political category in a way. And you're giving power to the West by doing that. And so I think it's this whole idea of, well, you know, the way I started thinking about it is, well, why are we simply assuming that all of this stuff, all of this great work is Western, right? And there, you know, Pinar Bilgen's work was very influential on the way I started thinking about it, that really we need to be much more, you know, aware of how knowledge develops and historically how it has developed, that it's always a process of interaction. And that, you know, you could say, well, all of these ideas that we now assume to be Western, and of course that has a lot to do with, you know, the politics of power as well, and how the West has kind of claimed many ideas, I think, as being Western as well. So it's not just people from the non-West saying those are Western ideas, it's the West that has kind of usurped them. And I think a big part of the project, as Pinar says, is kind of reclaiming those ideas for the non-West, and either saying, you know, they have multiple origins, or they are the product of, you know, centuries of interaction and exchange of ideas, which, you know, as a result of how power and knowledge works, have now somehow been just associated purely with the West. And so I think this speaks to this idea as well of why many people in, say, parts of the global South, and again, you know, I'm always very careful of speaking as firstly a white South African, right? So, you know, and often I'm asked to speak about African IR, which I feel very uncomfortable about. It's the same as, you know, we've had this discussion about, you know, you're from Africa, so you can teach a thesis seminar on Africa, right? Because clearly, yeah, you should know about that stuff. But anyway, so I think it's a kind of similar thing where people from, dare I say, Africa, for example, or, you know, African states will say, but why can't I use realism? You know, I like it. Is it what? Who are you to tell me that that's a Western theory, right? In IR, we've come to associate it with a particular, you know, American, you know, version of realism. But the essence of the idea, you know, behind it, this idea that states or actors are self-interested, it's all about power. This is not a Western thing, right? So I think that's kind of part of it as well. And yeah, so maybe just your point about Africa. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's, you know, this happens in a lot of places where scholars are expected to do certain things to be seen as legitimate. And so in South Africa after 1994, and of course, this has to do with the whole project of the state's identity. So South Africa wanting to be accepted by Africa as an African state, because of course before it was very much not seen as part of Africa. And this filtered through into academic work as well. And so I think there was this kind of drive to say, okay, we have to include Africa in everything now to show that we are part of the African continent. And it kind of led to what I sometimes heard from students as well, a sense of African fatigue. This whole idea, which comes back to what I said earlier, that because you're from Africa, you're expected to only be interested in things African. And you're gonna, if you're writing a PhD thesis, I've heard this from Brazilian scholars as well, when they go and study, in the UK, for example, they want to do a PhD on something else, maybe an abstract topic, maybe theory. And I'm thinking particularly of Renata Sommer, who mentioned this. And she was told, but shouldn't you be working on something, Brazilian related? Because you're from Brazil, So it's again then these assumptions that are made about what you should or shouldn't be doing as a scholar from the Global South. And there my book drops. Wow, I think that indicated the end of my rant.
It's a very helpful rant, Karen. Can I just say one thing about sort of the whole Rhodes Must Fall? When that whole movement happened, and soon afterwards there were these in South Africa conferences on decolonizing IR and everything, and some of them were, like you said, very radical. I remember being in South Africa, where in India at the same time, our current government had started being very nativistic, saying, kind of weird things, pushing money, into projects which are weird, like Lord Ganesha had, was the first plastic surgery. India had a nuclear weapon back in the ancient time, those sorts of things. And at JNU, there was this protest, and JNU was made anti-national because it does Marxist work, which is Western work. So in a way, so I remember going to one of the conferences where everyone goes for decolonize everything. We don't want to learn from white people, that sort of stuff. I mean, all of it, of course, is not, but some of it can be too radical. And I was coming from a very different position, although I like to identify myself as post-colonial, but there are dangers of nativism, of radicalism turning into reactionary tendencies, which I think we always have to be, have to understand. But also these two sort of instances happening simultaneously for me was a big learning curve that, in terms of how to pursue your scholarship. Can I just push you both on something that's happening currently? And I see, because of what's happening in the world, race becoming an important issue, and Europe beginning to question, and there are a lot of conferences being organized. But one of the tendencies I see is sometimes, within Europe, there's a thing, how do you write from non-Western perspective? And this is the point, Karen, you made earlier. Why should Europeans write from non-Western perspectives? I mean, you should write, from, you should try and incorporate non-Western perspectives and all that. But Europeans exclusively writing from non-Western perspectives also seems to be slightly problematic, because then you're also sort of appropriating the discourses from elsewhere. So what is your sort of take on those sorts of issues?
Well, yeah, I think maybe going back to what I said earlier, I think we should try and avoid these dichotomies, right? So yeah, I think if you say, well, as a Dutch scholar, are you going to be writing from an African perspective? You're again assuming that certain things are African and certain things are European. So I think you should write from whatever perspective is useful for what you're trying to say. And I think it's really important to not limit yourself to the kind of knowledge that or the kind of sources that you are familiar with or that you were taught as an undergraduate student. And so that might mean, and I think it should mean, if you want to kind of engage a broader, more inclusive scholarship, I think you should be looking for ideas from wherever. I mean, in the same way, I don't see it as being necessarily different. Looking outside of IR as a discipline towards other disciplines for ideas that could potentially be useful for your own thinking. It's the same way that I find it very useful to look at Chinese ideas about relationality, for example. I mean, I'm not claiming that I'm writing from a Chinese perspective, but I think those ideas can be very useful. And maybe I should just add one thing there, which relates to this idea about, you know, a kind of nativist or kind of more radical approach to writing IR. I think the thing that's been probably most valuable in the time I've spent looking at, you know, different contributions from IR from different parts of the world outside of the West as well, is how much they do actually have in common. And so, you know, I think you miss out on a lot if you're saying, and Audrey mentioned earlier that, you know, she was worried that South Africa would be a unique case, which South Africans would love to hear, because, you know, South Africans think, you know, South Africa is an exceptionalist, you know, country in all ways. So, you know, when you think about applying, you know, African ideas like Ubuntu, for example, you know, you only have to look a little bit at ideas from Latin America, like Sumak Kosai, or the whole idea of, you know, relationality in Chinese IR. And there's so many interesting overlaps that I think, you know, thinking that, oh, this is a kind of purely South African or Southern African idea that, you know, has no relation to the way people are thinking anywhere else in the world. That to me is a very dangerous position, and it reinforces the kind of thing that I think we're trying to address in the first place, right? So, but again, I'm talking too much.
No, you're not, Karen. So, but you see the paradox in the way the conversation is framed. So if you don't produce the type of work that I define as emancipatory, if you don't publish in the type of journal I value, you dominated by the West. But then if you do what I say that is defined by the West, are you not? So here, through this emancipatory discourse, you position half of the planet in a double bind, that whatever they do, they end up following a discourse defined in the universities that have the more resources and money. So it's a very disempowering emancipatory discourse, in my opinion, that at the moment in the fieldwork I saw that was only internalized and disempowered by people who had limited experience of internationalization, etc. But it has effect, it has negative effects. And as you say, Karen, people are lost. So what am I supposed to do? I want to be emancipated. I want to serve pluralization, and I'm stuck because if I do that, if I work on Africa, therefore that means I'm condemned as doing I do Ashari and Byzantine, like subsystemic work and producing local case for the North. But if I don't work on Africa, that means I'm prevented from working on my context, and I'm just following Western ideas. So whatever I do, I end up being dominated. How is this idea, how is this discourse empowering? So that is one thing. Another thing I think I want to say about that is the idea that we actually know European IR. And this is what the book series I'm co-editing is about, Trends in the European IR, is that the fact that this local perspective, this African perspective, that there is no one African perspective, there is no one Chinese perspective, but etc. Actually, do we know about the European perspective? Because when people talk about Europe, what they know is people in the rich universities of the UK, in the rich universities in Northern Europe. If I ask people, how much do you read Spanish IR? How much do you read Italian IR? How many co-authorship you have with people in Eastern Europe or in Estonia? I'm not sure a lot of people are doing that. So first, Europe is not London and Copenhagen. Second, the knowledge produced in Europe is as localized, as local, as the knowledge produced in Brazil. And I think we need to stop. One very hygienic way of producing knowledge is to stop all those double standards. Everyone needs to have a knowledge of their context, and in the context in which their own knowledge is produced. Everyone should be incentivized to be reflexive, not only white scholars should be incentivized of being reflexive, etc. I think the double standard and the way unconscious definition of the self and other are legitimized through the double standard is very dangerous in any case. And in the case of, maybe now it's me talking too much, but in the case of the national tradition and the interest of national tradition, there is diversity, there is commonalities, there is diversity, but the diversities are often not what the critical scholarship wants to hear about. A lot of diversity is linked to relation to the state, to different disciplinary boundaries, to different type of nationalism. It's not about like indigeneity, it's not about fancy cultural aspect. And there is a clash between those two types that, as you say, can have negative effects, for example, in the form of nativism. And in the case of India, it was very clear, like in the case of people being kind of very attracted by Kautilya writings. And I saw interaction in international conference, oh, but what, it would be so amazing. So let's say a Western scholar talking to a young Indian scholar working on nuclear policy and like things. IR in India is a matter of national security. It's not a fancy, it's national security. And people are invested in trying to find solution or invested for nationalistic purpose in defending Indian position. And then you have a random scholar saying it will be amazing if you use Kautilya as a framework. And I say in the book, like, are we asked as European to read Latin books to produce IR, and am I disempowered because I'm not using a Latin framework? This is what a Sanskrit book feels like in India. And especially this Sanskrit book, as you said, Vinit, is on the conservative side in India. Now it is like reinvested and has different meaning with post-colonialism, but it is not a neutral book in the context. Okay, it's who has liked it traditionally, people invested in the Sanskrit tradition, people interested in nationalistic, militaristic vision of the nation. So people, like you say, trained in Marxist tradition at GNU are not naturally inclined in liking this type of book. And you take that scholar with all the diversity of their Indian experience and you say, if you don't use that book, it is because I dominate you. And you see, there are so many layers that are problematic in that.
I mean, the two things here that Audrey raised, and the first was about, what is European IR? The European IR is as localized as the Brazilian IR. And I was going to ask Karan this question later, but I think I need to ask you about the Global South textbook here. And then there's a second question of diversity and certain kind of elitism within the national traditions. And that's the second question I'll come to. But I first want to come to the Global South textbook. And now the two sort of great aspects, I mean, there are several great aspects about that textbook, but one that it's sort of, the whole project is led by women, some of the, best women in IR. So now we'll have two of the best Global South sort of textbooks in IR entirely by women. But second, in your book, I mean, most of the scholars are actually from the Global South. How did you manage that coup? But broadly, the question I wanted to ask was, why did you feel a need for a Global South textbook? And it's been a long process, 7-8 years for that to come through.
I think longer.
Why did you feel the need for a textbook like that?
So yeah, so I mean, I should say that I came to the project as a co-editor later, but I was involved in it from the beginning. So this is something that a number of people had started talking about a long time ago, and it's really part of the whole project of globalizing IR, whatever you want to call it. And here I should mention, I know, Ole Wever has got a lot of criticism recently, but, he was one of those early voices, together with his book series with Arlene Tickner, who were looking at this. And so I think, and this comes back to maybe a point that we can come back to a little bit later when we talk about teaching, but I think the whole idea behind it was that people were thinking about, you know, the importance of bringing in non-Western or voices from the Global South in terms of researching IR, right? But there seemed to be a little bit of a lack in terms of teaching, that was, and I mean, for me, that's really where it's most important, right? The fact that you are exposing young scholars of IR, you know, from the first year. So when they first get introduced to IR, that they realize that you know, it's problematic the way in which IR has been taught until now as being predominantly about, you know, certain things and from a certain perspective, and that they're kind of sensitized to that. And so there was this idea that, yeah, you know, it would be great to have a book that would actually be accessible to not just scholars, and this was important, right? Not just scholars in the Global South. So again, it's not this kind of thing of, okay, you know, these poor students in the Global South, you know, they don't have a textbook of their own. It was really about saying, well, you know, we need a textbook that is more inclusive also for scholars in the Global North. So it kind of speaks to some of the ideas that we were talking about earlier, right? So not necessarily making this distinction. Right. And yeah, it went through a lot of different incarnations, because there was a lot of debate about, you know, how should we do this? And I think one of the things was that you inevitably get caught up in, well, how do we structure a book like this? And, you know, what do we focus on? And eventually we did focus on concepts. And of course, you know, then you open yourself up to criticism. Well, you're basing it on concepts that are familiar in the kind of, you know, Western version of IR. But yeah, my response to that would be, well, who says it's Western, right? So again, and yeah, we tried very hard to get a range of people. We weren't successful with getting everyone that we wanted, you know, because people, for various reasons, you know, can't commit, or they have other things going on. But I think, you know, we don't exclusively include people from the Global South, and that again speaks to what we talked about earlier. And so it's really just trying to think IR differently. And I think predominantly what we really try to do is draw on experiences from the Global South. So whether those are then interpreted by people from the Global South or people who were not originally perhaps from the Global South, you know, that is kind of not as important perhaps.
So then coming to the second question was about, you know, diversity within the national traditions. Now, it's like, for India, I know it's very Delhi-centric, and Audrey, you talk about it in the book. Not even Delhi-centric, it's very JNU-centric, you know, IR in some ways. But I was wondering if you guys could give us sort of a bit of a lay of the land of how it is in Brazil and how it is in South Africa. So South Africa, I guess, is a little more diverse, but also how, you know, sometimes certain individuals can start, you know, a whole tradition some places, while in other places they can't. Right, in your case, Corin, you know, in Stellenbosch, there's Philip Nel, and there are a lot of his students doing, you know, interesting constructivist, Gramscian, that kind of work. And a lot of them come through, but there are other places where there were other professors. I mean, I talked to like PV in a couple of weeks ago. I mean, he probably would have loved to do something like that, but he couldn't do that in Grahamstown. So what are the conditions that lead to this diversity in South Africa? You know, there are 5 or 6 departments doing IR. It's not just focused on one department. And how's it in Brazil? Is it more diverse, or is it also very sort of located at 1 or 2 places?
Audrey, do you want to start?
Okay. So in Brazil, you have in IR, the development of IR is both linked to more, like, there is a intellectual diversity, but also a more institutional diversity, in the sense that it's a system with private and public universities, and private universities are mostly training people for, let's say, practical skills in IR, for example, international relations for business and trade and this kind of things. So it's much more, let's say, inclusive than IR as will be defined by the American canon, because it's way beyond political science. And in the more kind of academic or academically oriented IR, you have different traditions linked also to the history of internationalization of Brazilian faculty. So let's say IR emerged in Brazil from the tradition of history of IR in the University of Brasilia, but then with the absence of PhD program, people were trained abroad and came back. And they came back with different type of traditions, with critical traditions, with American positivist quantitative tradition, and this different type of tradition that are transnational, they institutionalized in Brazil in different poles. So you have this type of professionally oriented IR, mostly in private institution. You have this historian IR tradition that was, let's say, the historical one in Brasilia, but in fact, that is very inspired by French history, that was very inspired by French history of IR. You have critical theories-oriented IR, and then you have American, let's say what people identify usually as American positivist, quantitativist IR. And actually what is interesting in Brazil is that the three main poles that are Brasilia, Rio, and São Paulo, often they are identified as Brasilia representing the history tradition, PUC-Rio representing the critical tradition, and São Paulo representing the American tradition. So this is simplistic, but actually you have this geographical organization that is also a double level between the big centers and the big university capacities of the big centers and the smallest universities, for example, in the region, in the interior of the country. So the specialization of IR and metropolis versus non-metropolis also plays a big role. But you see how here national tradition in a country like Brazil, where the national tradition was constructed through transnationalization movements. What is actually national about that? What is actually foreign about that? And what I say in the book is contrary to what people do in Canada about indigenous IR, etc. You have the same number of indigenous population in Brazil, which could be considered like the pre-colonial international relations, because they have different social groups, etc. This is not explored in Brazil. The same way there are a lot of autochthonous groups in India that are not investigated for international relations purposes.
Yeah, well, Vanita, I think you probably know as much about South African IR as I do, so you should come in on this as well. I mean, you mentioned individuals. I think individuals are really important, and this again speaks to the point I've been making all along. You know, that we should be very careful about generalizing about any kind of place, because I think one individual can really make a difference in terms of the trajectory of how things are studied. You know, what students are exposed to, etc. And so, like I said, while Stellenbosch perceived from the outside might be this very kind of conservative, you know, slightly backwards place, in fact, I think it was really at the forefront of, a kind of more progressive IR from the 90s onwards. And you mentioned that, you know, there was this group of people already. I remember in my third year as an undergraduate, you know, studying Cox, having a course, I think that was exclusively based on Cox's, I call it his black book, right, before the green book. And that was, you know, a group of people. It was people like Herman Thiel, Lisa Thompson, Tony Leysens, who then subsequently wrote a book about, you know, Cox and his scholarship. And I think then, you know, Ian Taylor, who's now at St. Andrews, came and did his PhD at Stellenbosch. And he, I think, was influenced by these ideas. So I think that's how he came to Cox. You might correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the idea I got. And Philip now was an interesting character because I think he was also open to being influenced by the students, which I think was, you know, so again, if I remember correctly, it was, you know, Philip was introduced to kind of critical theory, Coxian IR, by this group of younger scholars in a way, right? And he then became more interested in that, and I think that influenced his work subsequently on things like inequality. And the same with constructivism. We had these people coming and going. So again, you know, this idea that you have these influences from the outside, which then impact on the work of people. So I'm thinking, you know, for example, we had Audrey Klotz, who at the time was doing her project on, you know, norms and South Africa. And so obviously, you know, just through her presence in the department for, I think it was a semester, people started engaging with constructivism. And, you know, remember that South Africa was lagging behind because the academic society had basically been cut off due to the academic boycott. So really until the early 90s, South African IR was realism, essentially, right? So, you know, there wasn't any engagement with all the debates that were happening outside. So everybody had to kind of catch up later. But then, you know, there were other interesting characters. Like I said, Patrick McGowan, you know, who's very much a kind of, Wallersteinian world systems theory. He was there, he was teaching both undergraduate and postgraduate. So that's how they came to think about, you know, IPE. Tim Shaw, you know, and his wife, Jane Parpart, they were regular visitors as well. And so, of course, you know, Tim, together with Kevin Dunn, did one of the first books in 2001 looking at Africa, Africa's challenge to international relations, where they really, you know, that was one of the things that really influenced me as well. So looking at how some of these scholars were saying, what are some of the problems in trying to apply conventional IR scholarship to understanding, you know, the dynamics of what's happening in the African context. So that's Stellenbosch, and I'm talking a lot about Stellenbosch, but I think, you know, we've seen interesting developments in other parts, other South African universities. Of course, there's also the thing about where the IR section or department is based. So if I'm correct, there's still only one, you know, IR department, and that's at the University of the Witwatersrand. Everywhere else, they are part of politics departments. And so that, of course, has an influence on the field. But I want to come back finally again to individuals, because I think, again, thinking of someone like Philip Null, you know, his background, he was trained as a philosopher. And I think that inevitably shaped the way that he approached international relations, and then, you know, the way in which he engaged with the field and influenced those of us who worked with him as well.
So next question actually was going to be about, do you see sort of a generational change in terms of, you know, scholarship that's happening and Karan, you partly answered that question for South Africa, but it's also, I guess, you know, there is an individual, but it's also, I guess, affected by the changes that are happening in the field, right? So like in case of India, you know, Stephen Cohen is that one institution who kind of produced a whole lot of these scholars doing, you know, IR, but more from a realist perspective, largely. And a lot of them came back to India and produced the next generation, people like Kanti Bajpayee and others, produced the next generation of scholars, you know, like Siddharth Malarapu, who was constructivist. Kanti Bajpayee was probably more liberal realist. And Siddharth Malarapu's students have become, almost everyone is a post-colonial scholar. So there's a generational shift that happens, I mean, at least in India, but it's also influenced by, you know, what's happening in the field. So for instance, like in my generation, I've said this in the previous webcast we had, you know, we are a LibGen generation. So we had a lot of access to material which the previous generation did not have. But similarly, somebody who was working in the 70s did not even have access to, say, JSTOR. Even JNU did not have access to JSTOR. I mean, most universities in India still don't have access to JSTOR. Audrey says in her work that only 20% of universities in India actually do research. 80% don't even do research. So, you know, that's sort of the... but Audrey, I mean, you've actually worked in India and Brazil. Do you also see... because I remember in the book, you do make a case about that there is a generational shift that happens. You know, there's a 90s generation, there's a 2000s generation. So how are the shifts? I mean, I'm speaking more from a personal perspective, but how do you see the shifts in India and Brazil from a scholarly perspective?
So in Brazil, in every interview, scholars will have markers to identify themselves in the type of generation they are. And very clearly analyzing the interview material, you could distinguish the different generations. There is an intellectual shift in terms of university capacities, professional objectives, etc. And I had expected arriving in India that actually India and Brazil experienced the same type of opening and same type of political, not exactly the same type, but with potentially the same effect. The political changes in the 80s, 90s potentially had the same type of effects in academia. Economic opening potentially had the same effect, and I expected that the generation will be the same. And for 3 weeks of the first interviews in India, nobody was identifying generations. Nobody was talking about themselves in generational terms. And I'm like, I cannot find the changes. And I was looking for the changes. And this is the difficulty of comparative analysis, sometimes that you project something on the other case. So I was projecting the generational shift of the opening of Brazil in India, because the country as a whole had the transformation, but this transformation was not visible in India. And in fact, what scholars were telling me is that they were disappointed by the stagnation. Right. And I had a hard time hearing it because I was projecting generational shifts. And so to answer your question, I think the shift, rather than being a shift in terms of field, it was more a shift in terms of identity, and the young scholars starting to be much more actually both the generation of scholars who started to work in the 90s and the generation of scholars finishing their PhD, they were both sides of the same equation and actually of the same issue, that both performing the hierarchical Indian configuration in academia, with a very, very strong hierarchy between teachers and students. They were performing what you talked about, like explicit politicized post-colonial, anti-colonial discourse, while in the knowledge production doing often something else, like much more realist, etc. And when at the same time there was a mismatch between what they were actually experiencing privately, and they were perceiving and they were reflexive about this mismatch. And something, for example, that touched me a lot when I started the fieldwork, people were very distrustful that I could actually gather data of people on my own field. They said, oh, people will lie to you. They will not want to show you the way academia works because actually you work in the same field. And actually I'm very grateful because in India and Brazil, people were very open, surprisingly very open about showing me the way they work. And in India, someone like with a very influential position told me, well, this is the way I have to be hierarchical. This is the way it works, but I suffer from that. And the way I talk to you as equal and as a human being, I cannot address my own students like that. And I'm stuck in that system, and I don't know how to get out of it. And I want you to see that. And he said, I would like you to stay during my office hours. And I was in the back in the office hours, and the office hours were humiliation. And he wanted me to see that and say, look, this is what I experience. And the fact is that because students on the other side of the equation are also performing that on me, if I don't do that, they will not respect me. If I try something else, like in India, like teachers teach like very large amount. There is a massification of student, very large amount. If I don't do that, I don't have a private life. Okay, so there are also structural things. So this was interesting to see that. I think this, for example, is a shift that happened for those two generations that, for example, didn't happen in the relationship with the two previous generations. People were not questioning the issue and the way there was a mismatch between actually what they were performing and the way it was affecting them privately. Yeah. And now actually those two generations, they are experiencing that they want something else, but they don't know yet how to manifest that into their everyday practice.
I mean, so Indian academia is, of course, a completely different beast. So, you know, when I was reading Audrey's book, I was reading as if it's my own biography, because there are a lot of things I was like, oh yeah, I would have said that as well. And there's one particular thing relating to what you were just saying, which was about, you know, when internationalization happened, when people started going to conferences, what did they gain out of it? And a lot of Indians say it's not the academic, you know, content that they gain. It's not really, you know, that the papers are read and that sort of stuff. The gains are psychological. And Audrey has this very interesting interview excerpt where she asked somebody, so what did you do when you went to America? And this person says, oh, I went and hiked with these people, and, you know, we went hiking. But it's that sense of, you know, being equal to white people, I guess. But also there's this constant sense of inferiority that, you know, Indian academics tend to have. So I was reading your book and I was remembering, you know, Edward Shills wrote this, you know, this modernization theorist, wrote this piece in the 50s about the Indian intellectual. And he says the Indian intellectual suffers from double inferiority. One, a sense of inferiority of not knowing India enough, because you don't know the Kautilyas and all that. That's why everyone is trying to read Kautilya now. But also, you know, you also have the sense of inferiority against the West. And it's caught in that double bind of double inferiority. What I want to know from both of you is that, is it exceptional to India, or is it also the case in Brazil and South Africa? But I understand it also differs according to the racial category one is talking about, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could just also, you know, speak partly from own experience. And you know, I think I remember going to my first international conference, and I think specifically coming from a country, and maybe South Africa is a little bit different in this way in that it was insular for so long, right? So, you know, people were going to, you know, I always joke about our old Prime Minister B.J. Foster at the end of the 1970s, you know, who under the international sports boycott, you know, very kind of, what should we say, you know, declared to the National Party convention, he said, you know, if they won't play with us, we will play with ourselves. And so, of course, you know, this was kind of indicative of you know, many things in South Africa at the time. So, you know, everything was insular. The sports competitions were between different provinces in South Africa. You know, the academic, ever this sense of, you know, how will I be judged when I present my work outside? You know, there was no way of, you know, being able to know whether you were, you know, up to a certain standard. And so I remember going to my first international conference and actually feeling a sense of relief, I think, and thinking, wow, okay, these people are not, you know, as impressive perhaps as I thought they would be. And I think that, and so subsequently, I've always said to students, you know, get to international conferences and just go and listen to the panels, because it'll give you such a sense of confidence that, in fact, what you're doing, you know, is in many ways perhaps even better than what you're going to be hearing there from, especially what you consider to be the big names. Right. You know, there's this idealization, I think, sometimes of some of the big IR scholars, and I have to say, I'm not going to mention any names, but, you know, I've been mainly disappointed when I've listened to them at international conferences, and I've found the insights from people, you know, at the panels that I tend to go to, which is all about the Global South, you know, much more interesting and innovative and critical. So maybe I'll just leave that there.
Audrey, about Brazil.
Yes, so what Karen, what you're saying, it was very frequent. It was the main discourse in the interviews, that people are socialized to believe they don't have the level. They are socialized to believe that the West, so there is a kind of a merge between the idea that there is structural inequalities and the fact that a group of people is dominated at the interactional level by another group of people. And this structural denunciation leads people to believe, and I mean, it's formulated in a way that people anticipate that they will arrive at an international conference and they will be completely bullied. So the interviews I collected, it's about this trajectory, people telling how what they perceived and how their mind was blown when actually they attended the conference and other people were normal. Like they were not specially kind to them, not specially unkind to them, not specially intelligent, not specially stupid, and they were just feeling it's a normal experience. And it's not to say that there is no discrimination, etc., but the way it was so amplified for people who didn't have experience of internationalization was actually creating self-censorship and creating anxiety. And one thing interesting in India is actually the people with some of the people with the most successful trajectory of internationalization were the people who didn't come from Delhi and didn't have a Hindi or English educated background. And actually the trajectory of going from their primary socialization to a university in Delhi was so hard that they perceive that then the sky is the limit. From Delhi to the international cannot be as hard as from where they were to Delhi. And for example, one interviewee that really touched me was a blind PhD student attending our conferences, because like his primary socialization was so hard, already reaching to do a PhD in Delhi, being a blind student, that for him the difference between being there and going to ISA was nothing. So this is also, I think, the way we need to perceive that. It's not as if the national is easy and then the international is hard. And so that is one thing I think that can answer the question. Another thing that can answer the question is the way that it is framed. It's framed as if scholars are only professionals. Global South scholars, they're only like academics, when in fact the experience of internationalization is a much more complex, much more personal experience. And the quote you were quoting from the book about this hiking experience is that one of the questions that I was often asking is, what did you learn? Like when you did this exchange abroad, what did you learn? And it was so hard to manage to collect data about professional learning, because every time the interviewees will talk to me about private stuff they learn. And so I give a few quotes that I keep asking the question. So when you were in that American university and you did this exchange, what did you learn, etc. And the interviewee keep telling me that he learned about hiking. And I say, yeah, but when you were with those scholars, or this scholar in particular, he told me about diet, because I had a very bad diet. And this guy, we went to California, and therefore he was. And so there is also an essentialization that the scholar from the Global South is obsessed by his interaction with the scholar from the Global North, and this is what is determining their life. When there is academic tourism from scholars from the Global South, they go to conferences with their families, they are enjoying their time, etc. So those are, I think, two things that...
Karen, I think I should be thankful that you were the chair for, I think, one of the first 3-4 conferences that I went to. You were always the chair on my panel.
How did that happen, Vineet?
I'll have to write my hiking experiences with you. Okay, so the last set of questions that I want to ask you is about the social aspects of knowledge. And the first obvious thing is about teaching. You know, that's where I think for any researcher, that's the primary field in which you contribute to, you know, betterment of society. And as, like I said earlier, I mean, it's objectively proved that you both are great teachers. What is it that you do which is different from when you were being taught? That's something that you didn't like, and you actively try not to do that. What are one or two things that both of you do in your own teaching?
Well, Vineet, I'll start by saying that you always have to be skeptical. Having said that, I didn't really have bad teaching experiences, I think. So I wouldn't say that I'm kind of actively doing something different. I think and you know, I've had to write many teaching, what do you call these things, teaching philosophies, etc., for part of teaching portfolios, and I always find it very difficult, and I always feel myself feeling a little bit yeah, perhaps you know, I feel guilty because I feel like I haven't invested so much time consciously in developing particular, you know, teaching activities or approaches. And you know, I have a lot of respect for very good teachers that I know who do this. They've invested a lot of time in this. And so I've taken a little bit, I think, what's, you know, a lazy option. And that is, I try to simply be myself in the classroom, because I think this is something which I maybe, you know, thinking back to my own, especially undergraduate studies, that, you know, there's this sense of formality in the classroom that I, you know, that wasn't necessarily, or didn't necessarily make, yeah, the subject matter accessible to me. And so when I think back, the lectures that I enjoyed most were those who were just, they seemed to be just themselves having a conversation in the classroom, you know, rather than lecturing or teaching. And so I think that's what I try to do, kind of subconsciously, but like I said, it's not a conscious strategy. So I like to have a conversation in the class, and of course it's easier in a smaller kind of seminar class. So in that sense, you know, we're lucky at Leiden that we're teaching, you know, never more than 20 students, at least in the programs that, you know, that I'm in. And the other thing is, you know, I've always had this thing about stories, and so teaching as a storytelling in a way. And I think that's also what I try to do. So yeah, it's, you know, it's not rocket science. I can't tell you that I have any particular, you know, pedagogical strategy that I've developed over the years. Yeah, that's pretty. And I think also just, you know, recognizing the fact that I'm not in any way intellectually superior to the students in my class. I mean, you know, I always think about it. The only reason I might know more about a particular subject is just because I've been reading about it for 20 years longer than they have. That's essentially it. And you know, I'm always just very positively surprised by, if you give students a little bit of freedom and you encourage them to think creatively, the amazing things they come up with that, you know, there's no way I could have taught them that. So it would be completely presumptuous of me to think that, you know, I'm going to be able to teach them everything they need to know. Absolutely not. So, yeah.
I mean, I can't remember who said this, but somebody said this: I know more than my students because I read the thing half an hour before them. Audrey, so what do you do different in the class?
So actually, I didn't have a lot of the time a good experience as a student. I thought the teachers didn't care about our learning curve. They were just dumping words on us. The seminar teachers, they were doing what they thought they would do, and nobody cared about whether or not we were transformed. And the contrast between that and like my teaching experience in my hobbies, like if you do sports, you need to be ready for the competition season. If you do artistic activity, you need to be ready for the show. And there is a learning curve, and you see yourself being transformed by the learning experience. And I felt that in a lot of the teaching I had in France, nobody cared about that. Nobody cared whether I was transformed or I was stagnating. And it was such a waste of time and resources for everyone and for society. So this is something that I was like, oh, maybe I'm arrogant and I think that when I would be a teacher, I will be able to do better. But in fact, it's more complicated than that. And I hope that when I went at LSE, that maybe because we have more money, actually, it will be easier to do something different. And maybe people actually are not invested because they are not well paid and etc. And I see how the money is creating another form of passivity in the commodification of higher education, and the fact that students pay high fees and that teachings become a service, is that there is now a form of micromanagement, individualization, a spoon feeding that in fact for me is harmful to the autonomy and the creativity of the student, that they need, we need to have like one-on-one support, etc. But if it becomes too individualized. In fact, we end up being some kind of coach or personal assistant for the student. And I feel the neoliberal university is kind of pushing me towards that. And to the point that it's hard for students to teach them how actually to create a path on their own when there is no path, and to tell them it's okay if you're afraid, you can overcome that. Because as soon as there is a bit of fear, you need to be here supporting, giving an answer, giving a reading. And for me, this is not what is favoring critical citizenship. And people will be able to solve problem when there seems to have no solution. So there is this real thing about passivity and how to address that. And I'm trying to address that within this education system that is now the norm in the UK and that LSE is very representative of. How do you support without doing instead of the student?
Okay, so the final question is about sort of the social dimension of the research or sort of work that you're doing. Audrey, for you, I mean, your current work focuses on, methodologies for critical theories, which suddenly has become very important. I wouldn't say why, but I mean, Olivier was mentioned earlier, he's been cancelled. But we'd like to know what are the specific issues that you're looking at in this work, in your focus on methodologies for critical theories. And Karen, of course, we can't let you go without talking about the elephant in the room. I'll speak like a university, administration person. How do your critical IR skills help you in your work as the special advisor to the UN Secretary General? Audrey, perhaps you could go first.
So like this idea, methodology for critical theories, is that now we have accepted this idea. A lot of scholars have accepted this idea that discourse and knowledge are not neutral, and our job is to produce discourse and knowledge. So how do you deal with that? Now that this is a thing, this is an assumption at the core of the theories called critical theories. How do you deal as a professional with that? One option is one option that some postmodernists has adopted, is some kind of nihilism, saying then we cannot trust any discourse and any knowledge. Everything is dangerous. There is no emancipation. For me, then when I hear that, I'm like, then why do you do this job? Okay, if you don't believe in discourse and knowledge, why are you actually in academia? Do something else. Another type of response is creating yet another binary and saying, no, but actually discourse and knowledge are potentially reproducing the social political order, but not the one I produce, just the one they produce. The mainstream, the West, white men, but because I'm critical, my knowledge is emancipatory. And this is one of the themes in the book. Then I ask, how do you know that? How do you know what you think you know about yourself and the knowledge you produce? And here we have another danger, is thinking that because we self-claim that our knowledge is emancipatory, we stop investigating it. And it becomes just a denunciation. And so therefore, this is the type of issue that I aim to address by unpacking and developing pedagogical tools so scholars can address this paradox. And I mean, this has been done before. The whole tradition of participatory research is about that, is about how do you deal with that, how do you produce knowledge once you accept that, how do you say, assumption. Is that enough? Well, just to give an example, and people are like, oh, but we know about that. I mean, I always have students coming to me. I've been told to problematize categories of analysis. Be careful about categories of analysis. How do I do that? And they don't know how to do that. Saying to someone, be careful about the words you use, don't make them know how to do that. Or you need to be reflexive. Being making warnings about being reflexivity shaming is not making someone reflexive. Okay, so we need to go from there, from putting it to the agenda, for acknowledging this importance, into creating tools that can be part of the socialization and of the democratization, and also of the mainstreamization of that. For me, this is not for critical scholars. Legitimizing reflexivity is creating material that quantitative scholars can find legitimate and integrate in their work. So this is what I try to do.
Great, thanks. Karan, this is where you sell humanities-based IR.
So yeah, I mean, I have to be careful what I say. So obviously I'm wearing my academic hat now, right? Not the other one, but I think what I have come to realize is how difficult it is to really reconcile these two in a way that's kind of satisfactory, right? Because yeah, the policy, well, I call it the policy world. I mean, in my case, the UN, it's so, yeah, I mean, there's so much kind of, there's so much structure that I feel, you know, exerting any kind of agency in a kind of structure like that is very, very difficult. And I've come to realize that. So it's in that sense, you know, it's also, it's frustrating, but it also gives me a lot of insight, I think, in terms of how difficult and complex global governance is. And it makes me happy to be able to retreat back into academia, where I feel I have more control, you know, over what I do and how I express myself, etc. But I think the interesting thing is that, you know, I just keep seeing the parallels between the work I do in terms of IR and what I see in the real world. So, you know, if we take a concept like the responsibility to protect, the same debates that we've been talking about, you know, here today, you know, they're reflected in that as well. So this whole thing about, oh, it's a Western concept, you know, it's being imposed on the global South. And of course, you know, this kind of argument is useful for different sides, right? So it's useful sometimes, I think, in the same way that it's useful for the very kind of radical scholars of, you know, decolonization and Africanization, saying something is Western, which then means you can immediately kind of write it off without saying, well, let's go and look at what's really behind this idea. And, you know, maybe this is something, the idea that you have some kind of responsibility or duty to people other than yourself. I mean, that's not a Western idea, right? So maybe the way in which it's now been formulated and, you know, the people who were instrumental in that, I think on that basis, it's kind of been seen as having taken on a kind of Western incarnation in a way. But I find myself being, seeing how again, you know, Audrey mentioned the word discourse early, how this is used so powerfully for, you know, political reasons to either justify action or inaction based on, you know, whether you say this concept is something which is Western or it's not Western, or it's universal or it's not universal. And so, yeah, I think I'm still thinking about all of this, and hopefully I'll be able to write something about it at some point.
Well, on that cynical note, thank you very much, both of you. It's been such an enriching discussion for me, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. But thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanita.